are also the ones that are paying for those improvements in the long run. So it sort of solves, in some cases, that mismatch between tenant and landlord needs when it comes to improving these buildings. So, we have benefits of CPACE for the community as well. And then I think I'm going to throw it back to Abby if I've got my slide count right. So CPACE as a whole, like we said, you know, why are local governments passing ordinances to enable this? It's because at the end of the day, CPACE financing is supposed to enable a public benefit that just happens to be accessed through private property, right? So even though this financing is being used to improve these individual private properties, it results in benefits that impact the entire public of a jurisdiction through supporting environmental goals, enhancing the built environment. This is an investment in a community's building stock. It creates local jobs for contractors, energy auditors, developers, and all other stakeholders that are involved in these types of transactions. As much as CPACE is an environmental benefit tool, it's also an economic development tool in this way. By enabling the financing of resiliency measures as well, which I don't believe were listed on a previous slide, it can increase community disaster resiliency. There's almost no burden on local government. So as we stated before, the funding for these transactions is coming from private capital providers. So this is in no way relying on public funds to finance, which means those public funds can be used to invest in other things that the local community needs. And as we've already discussed in the context of the current pandemic, it's an especially effective tool during challenging times to help build value both in the properties and throughout the community.
Great, thanks Jessa for that overview. I think that really summed up both what's going on around the country as well as what's going on in Virginia. So what I want to do in the next few slides is just kind of put in context how PACE can assist from a standpoint of capital, how it helps really reduce owners' equity that's required, helps make deals pencil, helps with obviously making projects more environmentally friendly, and also having lower operating costs. So on the left here on this slide, you see kind of the bar graph where you have a kind of a typical situation of a construction loan with some equity, both maybe mezz debt, preferred equity, and then cash from the developer. This is like representing a new construction project. You may have more sources of funding. You may have tax credits in there. You may just have a straight construction loan with like owner cash. There's obviously different iterations. We just try to show kind of like a typical situation where you have a few forms of equity coming in along with a construction loan. With CPACE, what we're seeing is two scenarios. I think if the slide moves down a tiny bit, we'll see the second, potentially the second. Maybe it's not showing up, it's a little bit off the screen, but it doesn't matter. Basically, these two scenarios show you that you can have the same kind of capital stack structure, and you can, however, use CPACE to pay for the value add projects, the environmentally or energy efficient or renewable energy projects that would be value engineered out typically of a project. So give an example, say I want to use geothermal on my property. Well, I really can't afford it in the normal scenario, but because of PACE will be able to help pay for that component. So that kind of adds on an additional funding source for the project. Also, it can also replace some of the capital needed, both potentially a little bit of the construction loan, but often the actual owner equity that's required. So if you have, say, a 75 or 80% construction loan, normally you have to put in 25% of owner equity. You can put in PACE in there and help reduce that amount. Next slide. And this is another example more for an existing building where you have three options about how to fund your project. You have the, in this graph on the, well, sorry, on the spreadsheet on the left, you have self-funded projects where basically the owner is paying for it out of pocket. They have no debt service, but obviously the impact is considerable, particularly in year one, because they had to come out of pocket for, say, the new HVAC equipment they had to have on their church or their office building or their hospital. Instead of self-funding, you can look at a loan. Typically, you're going to have to pay some out of pocket. You don't get 100% loan to cost or anymore. It's not like the pre-2008 days. In that scenario, you have savings you incur, just like if you self-funded, but you also have to pay some equity. And so you can see the impact as you go down on the net present value of that scenario. You're also having to use some of your own cash, not as much. In the PACE scenario, you basically pay nothing out of pocket for the new HVAC equipment, for example. You have to pay the PACE payment, but basically your impact is positive year one because the savings from the HVAC that you're making from more energy efficient equipment offsets the cost of the PACE assessment. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a little bit of a kind of the graphic form of how this would look like. Obviously, this is a simplified version. You can get much more complex, but we're pretty much showing you that with PACE, because you're paying nothing out of pocket, the time value of money is in your favor, and that results typically in a much higher net present value of your project over time. So that's looking at cash flow over time. And as Jessa mentioned earlier, you have these very long terms. And when you have really long terms you can do the PACE financing with, that lowers your annual payment. And, of course, there are permanent loans that can go out to 25, 30 years, but they're pretty picky. It's pretty hard, particularly right now. As Jessa mentioned, we've got, some constraints with the current kind of, more stringent requirements for underwriting with the current pandemic. It's harder and harder to get a loan. It's hard to get a loan at the rates that you got before, interest rates and terms, and the actual loan amount. So PACE, we're seeing more and more being really important to helping businesses be able to stay afloat and actually grow. So next slide, please. So this is an example of a case study that many of you or some of you may be familiar with up in DC. It is basically the new or pretty new DC United soccer stadium that used about 8% of the funding through CPACE to do a wide measure of really cool features, including LED, solar system, green roof, and a very innovative stormwater conservation system with their turf. So this is an example in new construction where they could really go beyond what they would have probably been able to do financially because they had the option of using CPACE. So in addition to obviously providing part of that capital stack that we showed in that slide with the three kind of bar graphs, you're also getting operating expenses which will go down over time because they were able to install very efficient equipment. So next slide, and I'm going to pass this back to Jessa because this is in Maryland. These are Maryland projects. So
yeah, so there's so many different case studies that we can share about CPACE. It really solves a lot of different needs for different borrowers. The example here of the nonprofit that we have on the left is a totally different case study, right, than from the Audi Stadium on the previous slide. This was a Baltimore-based nonprofit that wanted to make an expansion to its existing facility or to make an expansion as well as retrofit some of its existing facility. And, they were faced with the same underwriting cash flows that any nonprofit may have, right? They're not necessarily looking at the same cash flows every quarter. So they're, challenging for a traditional bank to underwrite. But they were able to access $785,000 of CPACE capital, you know, based upon the value of the property, and they were able to extend those payments out over 25 years in order to be able to better manage those annual payments, right? Extending $785,000 of payments over 25 years as opposed to over 10 is going to very significantly decrease how much they had to pay every single year. And in fact, due to the measures that were financed, particularly a new HVAC, they were able to save $3,000 in their first year of operation post-improvement and $80,000 in lifetime savings. So for this nonprofit, you know, PACE was a triple win. On the right, we have an example of a solar project. This one was actually in New York, not Maryland, but we do have solar examples in Maryland. This was an artisanal cheese making business that was looking for a way to reduce their electricity costs. So the owner used CPACE financing to fund a solar array on his farm, which was able to offset over 100% of the farm's electricity needs. They were, of course, cash flow positive in their first year. And you know, we've seen that same sort of project more locally. So here in Maryland, there was a soccer stadium that also installed enough solar to offset 100% of their annual electricity needs. And then we've had a number of other projects that have installed a smaller solar array component as part of a broader set of measures that were being installed and financed using CPACE.